The knock at dawn. There was something about living in a small suburban neighborhood that had always felt too good to be true. When I first bought my house, a charming two-story on a quiet cul-de-sac, I imagined barbecues with friendly neighbors, kids riding bikes on the sidewalk, and evenings spent on my front porch watching the sun set over the manicured lawns. For the most part, I got that. But the underbelly of our so-called perfect neighborhood came wrapped in a laminated handbook from the Homeowners Association, a collection of arbitrary rules written by people who seemed to believe they were the Supreme Court, Congress, and local law enforcement all rolled into one. I'm not new to rules. Hell, I'm the actual town sheriff. I enforce the law for a living. But the HOA, they weren't about law and order. They were about power. Petty, unnecessary power over nonsense like the shade of your front door, how high your grass was allowed to grow, and whether your holiday decorations were sufficiently tasteful. They loved throwing fines at me for things like leaving my truck parked half an inch too far onto the sidewalk, or daring to repaint my fence a slightly darker brown. But what happened on that particular morning? That was something no training, no years of dealing with criminals, domestic disputes, or bar fights could have ever prepared me for. It started with a knock, not the polite kind either. It was sharp, deliberate, and entirely too confident, like the person on the other side of my door believed they owned the very ground they stood on. I was still nursing my first coffee of the day, enjoying the calm before heading into the station, when that knock echoed through the house. From the reflection in my kitchen window, I saw them. 4 figures standing in my driveway, all dressed alike in matching navy polo shirts and khakis, like some kind of neighborhood enforcement strike team. Each had the unmistakable air of someone who had mistaken watching crime dramas for actual law enforcement training. One held a clipboard, another had a toy walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, and a third was clutching a pair of, no joke, bright orange plastic handcuffs. And at the center of it all, the ringleader, the queen of suburban chaos herself, Karen. Karen Thompson, self-appointed president for life of our HOA. Short, perpetually scowling, with the kind of energy that could turn a bake sale into a power struggle. Her hair was the color of overripe strawberries, her expression sour enough to curdle milk, and her stance screamed, "I own you." I took a slow sip of my coffee and opened the door just enough to lean casually against the frame. "Morning, Karen. To what do I owe the pleasure?" She didn't even let me finish the sentence before she thrust a laminated printout in my face. "You are in gross violation of community standards." My eyebrow twitched. "Is that so?" She tapped the paper with a manicured fingernail, each click making me want to slam the door just a little more. "Unregistered vehicles. Unauthorized modifications to your property." And she gave an exaggerated pause, as though preparing for the grand final, a history of aggressive and inappropriate behavior toward fellow residents. I barked a laugh before I could stop myself. "What does that even mean?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "It means you've made it clear you believe you're above the rules of this community. And, she said triumphantly, since you have refused to comply with repeated warnings, the HOA is exercising its right to enforce civil custody. You are hereby placed under detention until a formal hearing can be arranged." I blinked. "You want to arrest me?" "We have the authority," she said, her voice shrill with self-importance. "And if you resist, additional penalties will apply." The man with the beer belly and the plastic cuffs stepped forward, trying to look intimidating. It didn't work. The cuffs, which looked like they came from a kid's police costume set, dangled awkwardly from his pudgy fingers. I had dealt with armed fugitives, violent drunks, and the occasional lunatic screaming conspiracy theories in front of the courthouse. But this was something new. "You're serious," I said, just to make sure I hadn't slipped into some surreal alternate reality. Karen's smirk could have curdled cream. "Very." I sighed. "All right, I'll play along." I reached into my back pocket and flipped open my wallet, revealing my gleaming sheriff's badge. But if you're going to arrest me, I'm going to have to arrest you right back for impersonating law enforcement officers, unlawful detention, and attempted kidnapping." The silence that followed was beautiful. One of the clipboard warriors actually took a step back, as though my badge had emitted some invisible shockwave. Karen's face paled, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. You can't," she sputtered. "Oh, I absolutely can," I said, crossing my arms. "And if you don't get off my property in the next 5 seconds, I'll be adding criminal trespassing to the list." The four of them exchanged panicked glances. For all their bravado, they hadn't expected actual consequences. That's the thing about bullies. They thrive on fear, but the second someone calls their bluff, they crumble. One of the men whispered something to Karen, and her already flushed face turned bright red. "This isn't over," she snapped. "Looking forward to it," I replied. They turned and shuffled back down the driveway, their matching polos looking far less intimidating when paired with the awkward, defeated shuffles of people who had just been thoroughly outplayed. I watched them go, sipping my coffee with the satisfaction of someone who had just won the most ridiculous battle of his career. But I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to slink away and accept defeat. No, she was already plotting her next move, and if there was one thing I'd learned in my years as sheriff, it was that some people's petty obsessions could drive them to dangerous places. As the morning sun rose over the rooftops, I took another sip of coffee, already wondering just how far this deranged little HOA queen was willing to go. Whatever it was, I'd be ready. Because if Karen wanted war, she just declared it at the doorstep of the wrong man. The wrath of Queen Karen. The morning after Karen and her merry band of HOA wannabe cops retreated in disgrace, I expected things to simmer down. Maybe a few passive-aggressive emails, some flyers in the mailbox declaring me a menace to the neighborhood, the usual HOA tantrums. What I wasn't expecting was to wake up to a missing garbage can and a bright yellow violation notice duct-taped to my front door like it was a ransom note. The notice was so absurd I had to read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Notice of immediate sanction. Resident has violated Community Ordinance 14.7a. Unauthorized refuse container placement. As a result, waste collection privileges are hereby revoked until further notice. Further violations will result in escalated enforcement actions, up to and including formal community expulsion proceedings. Signed, Karen Thompson, President, HOA. I stood on my porch, barefoot, coffee in one hand, the notice in the other, and let out a slow whistle. It was breathtaking how fast Karen had shifted from pretending to be the law to running a full-blown dictatorship. Revoking my trash privileges, that was new. I half expected her to show up in a military uniform with a sash, giving orders to neighborhood toddlers in formation. After a solid minute of laughing, I walked to the curb. No garbage can. Not down the street, not tipped over in a ditch, just gone. Someone had swiped it clean off my property. And standing across the street, arms folded, was Karen. She was on her lawn, pretending to water a flower bed that contained exactly 2 wilted hydrangeas and a plastic flamingo with a broken leg. Her hose wasn't even turned on. She wasn't tending to anything. She was watching me, waiting to see my reaction. I gave her a little wave. She turned her back. "All right, Karen, game on." I headed inside, logged into my work email, and fired off a message to the County Waste Management Office, explaining that my trash can had mysteriously vanished overnight. The reply came back within an hour. "Dear resident, thank you for contacting us. According to our records, your waste collection privileges have not been revoked, nor has any removal order been placed for your address. If your bin was stolen, you are entitled to a free replacement. Please complete the attached form to request delivery. Sincerely, County Waste Management Office." So Karen hadn't even involved the county. This was entirely her little side project, an unauthorized trash coup carried out by HOA vigilance. I was still filling out the replacement form when my doorbell rang. This time, it wasn't Karen. It was my neighbor, Carl. He lived 2 doors down, a retired auto mechanic with a beer belly, 3 grandkids, and a golden retriever that barked at mail trucks like it was getting paid per woof. Carl was one of the good ones, the type who only cared if you borrowed his ladder without asking. Otherwise, he kept to himself and stayed out of HOA nonsense. "Hey," Carl said, leaning against the doorframe. "Figured I'd give you a heads up." "About what?" "Karen." I groaned. "What now?" Carl scratched his chin. "Last night, after you went to bed, I saw her and that clipboard guy. What's his name? Todd. Sneaking around your yard. They took your trash cans, hauled them off in Todd's wife's minivan." I stared at him, speechless. "They stole my garbage cans." "Yup, didn't even try to be subtle about it." "Did you get a picture?" Carl grinned, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. Sure enough, there was a grainy but unmistakable photo. Karen and Todd, side by side, dragging my garbage bins down the sidewalk like a couple of raccoons who'd graduated to organized crime. "Mind if I borrow this?" I asked. "Be my guest," Carl chuckled. "Honestly, I don't know why she's gunning for you so hard, but the whole block's watching. This is better than cable." That afternoon, I printed the photo, slapped it onto a piece of poster board, and walked right over to the HOA office, which was really just a folding table set up in the clubhouse basement. Karen was there, of course, holding court like she was running a Senate hearing. The moment I stepped into the room, her face froze. "Afternoon, Karen," I said cheerfully. "I just came by to drop this off." I slapped the poster board down on the table. The photo of her and Todd stealing my garbage cans took up most of the space, complete with the caption, "The HOA's new recycling program. Theft." The room fell into silence. A few other board members leaned forward to squint at the image. Todd, sitting off to the side, turned redder than a sunburned lobster. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is a baseless accusation." "Oh, I don't think so," I said, still smiling. "County Waste Management confirmed you didn't have any authority to mess with my service. So this is theft, plain and simple. Do you have any idea how disruptive you've been to this community?" Karen's voice rose in pitch, trying to regain control. "Your behavior is unacceptable." "You mean defending my property?" I shrugged. "Call it what you want. I call it following the law." That word, law, hit her like a slap. Her eyes narrowed to slits. "You think you're untouchable just because you wear a badge?" "No, Karen," I said, leaning on the table. "I'm untouchable because you have no actual authority over me, my property, or anyone else in this neighborhood." The silence stretched so long you could hear the tick of the clubhouse's cheap wall clock. Finally, one of the board members, an older woman who usually kept her mouth shut, spoke up. "Karen, maybe we should talk about this privately." Karen's jaw worked like she was chewing on nails, but she forced a brittle smile. "Fine. We'll discuss it later." I walked out, leaving the poster board behind. Let them all stare at it. Let them all think. The truth was, I didn't care about the HOA's opinion. But I knew something Karen didn't. Her little house of cards was starting to wobble. All it would take was one good gust of wind. And I intended to be that wind. That night, I found my garbage cans. They were stashed behind the clubhouse, half hidden under a tarp, as though concealing them would erase the crime. I hauled them back to my house and chained them to my fence with a heavy-duty bike lock. Let's see Karen explain that to her clipboard crew. The next morning, another violation notice appeared, this one complaining that the color of my chain was non-compliant with community aesthetics. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. Karen was escalating, which meant she was desperate. And a desperate Karen was bound to make mistakes. I dealt with criminals, grifters, and idiots for years. Karen wasn't even in the top 10. But there was something uniquely fun about taking on someone so drunk on their own power they thought they could arrest a sheriff in his own backyard. If Karen wanted war, She was about to find out exactly how much fight I had in me. Operation Total HOA Takeover. If Karen's garbage can heist was her opening act, the next few days made it clear that she was just getting started. See, most people, when faced with the threat of actual legal consequences, take a step back. Not Karen. No, she had the unique talent of doubling down on stupidity, like she was gunning for a spot in the HOA Hall of Fame for petty tyrants. The first sign that things were about to get interesting came in the form of an official-looking envelope jammed into my mailbox. Not mailed, just stuffed there like a ransom note. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in enough legalese to make a divorce lawyer's eyes water. But the gist was simple. Notice of immediate review. Residency termination proceedings. Due to your continued defiance of community standards, the HOA board has initiated a formal review to determine if you are eligible to remain a resident in this community. A disciplinary hearing will be held this Friday evening. Attendance is mandatory. Signed, Karen Thompson, President. I actually burst out laughing right there in my driveway. Karen was trying to evict me from my own house, the house I owned outright, in a neighborhood where the HOA's authority extended about as far as the decorative shrubbery rules and the color palette for front doors. I'd seen some nonsense in my years as sheriff, but this was something special. That afternoon, I swung by the station and had a quiet chat with a buddy of mine in the county clerk's office. Just for fun, I asked if there was any possible legal basis for a suburban HOA to forcibly evict a homeowner. He laughed so hard he spilled coffee on his tie. Only way they could get you out is if you were cooking meth in your basement or turning your house into an illegal petting zoo, he said, still chuckling. Even then, it'd take a court order. Perfect. The day before the big hearing, Karen stepped up her game. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying a quiet beer, when a tow truck rolled into my driveway. A scrawny guy in an ill-fitting safety vest hopped out and started eyeing my truck like it was a prize catch. "Can I help you?" I asked. Yeah," he said, shuffling his feet. "Got a work order from the HOA. This vehicle's in violation. Unauthorized commercial vehicle parked in a residential area." I stared at him. "This is my personal truck. It's registered to me." They said it had decals," he mumbled. I stood up, walked to my truck, and ran a hand down the spotless paint job. No decals, no sheriff's star, not even a bumper sticker. Karen was just making things up at this point. "Listen," I said, "do yourself a favor and go tell Karen this truck's going nowhere." He hesitated, then offered a shrug. "I still get paid for the trip." "Glad to hear it." He climbed back into his tow truck, flipped a U-turn, and left. Across the street, Karen stood on her lawn, arms folded, glaring like I'd personally canceled Christmas. I raised my beer to her in a silent toast. She stormed inside. Friday evening came, and I couldn't resist. I showed up at the HOA clubhouse, not because I respected the mandatory hearing, but because I wanted a front row seat to Karen's meltdown. The room was set up like some kind of kangaroo court. Rows of folding chairs lined up facing a table where Karen sat, flanked by Todd and a woman I only knew as Debbie the secretary, who spent most HOA meetings correcting everyone's grammar. A cheap plastic sign reading disciplinary review in progress hung crookedly from a whiteboard. Karen's smile was the kind you see on people who just found out they were getting audited. "Please be seated," she said, gesturing to a lone folding chair in the middle of the room, positioned like a defendant's chair in a TV courtroom drama. I took my time sitting, stretching my legs out and leaning back like I was settling in for a bad movie. Karen cleared her throat. "We are gathered here to review the behavior of resident." "Cut the theatrics, Karen," I interrupted. "Let's skip to the part where you tell me what imaginary crimes I committed." Her jaw clenched, but she soldiered on. "This community prides itself on adherence to standards. Your consistent defiance." "What standards?" I asked. "The ones you make up as you go along. Or the ones you only enforce on people who don't bow and scrape to you? Debbie looked scandalized. Todd looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. This isn't a debate, Karen snapped. The board has the authority to. No, you don't, I said, standing up. You have authority over the color of fences and whether someone leaves their Christmas lights up too long. You don't have the power to evict homeowners, confiscate property, or detain anyone. That's not true, Karen shouted. The HOA charter gives us. The HOA charter is toilet paper, I cut in. And you know it. The silence was glorious. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folder I'd brought just for this occasion. I flipped it open and started reading, loud and clear. Section 3, subsection B, paragraph 4. The HOA may recommend but not enforce any removal of homeowners in good standing. I held up the county assessor's report. No lions on my property, no unpaid dues, no violations documented by anyone outside your little cable. You've got nothing, Karen. Her face turned a stunning shade of red. That's not the point. It's exactly the point, I said, stepping closer to the table. You're not running a homeowners association. You're running a personal vendetta, and you're bad at it. I could hear whispers spreading through the room. The neighbors who'd been dragged here to witness my trial were starting to realize they were watching Karen's empire crumble in real time. Karen stood so fast her chair toppled over. You can't just ignore the rules. Watch me, I said. And while you're at it, watch for the formal complaint I'm filing with the county against you and this HOA for harassment, misuse of funds, and filing false claims with local authorities. Debbie gasped. Todd looked ready to faint. Karen's eyes bulged. You wouldn't dare, she hissed. I smiled. You've been trying to play sheriff, Karen. Problem is, the real sheriff's right here. I walked out, leaving her fuming in front of her shrinking audience. That night, I drafted the formal complaint. With Carl's photo evidence, the paper trail of bogus notices, and a handy recording of Karen's unhinged performance at the hearing, it was a slam dunk. The next morning, I found my truck completely covered in violation stickers. Top to bottom, like some psychotic art installation, Karen's final tantrum. It only made me laugh harder. She was running out of moves. And now it was my turn. Karen declares martial law. I should have known Karen wouldn't take public humiliation lying down. A kangaroo court disaster was supposed to be her big moment. The scene where she cast me out like some villainous exile while her adoring HOA minions clapped and cheered. Instead, she got a front row seat to me dismantling her authority in front of the very neighbors she counted on to fear her. But Karen wasn't the type to slink off into the shadows, lick her wounds, and reconsider her life choices. No, Karen was the type to triple down. The kind of person who, when handed a shovel, doesn't stop digging until she hits molten lava. The first sign that Karen's fragile grasp on reality had snapped completely came at 6:07 a.m. the following Monday. I was just about to head out for my morning run when I heard a series of loud metallic clanks right outside my front door. I opened it to find my entire driveway blocked off with bright orange construction fencing. In the middle of the fencing stood a wooden sign, spray-painted in uneven black letters. Emergency, COMMUNITY safety, CLOSUR. ALVE trafici prohibited, until FURTE or notice. And there, standing proudly with her arms crossed, was Karen herself, wearing what I can only describe as a tactical fanny pack and a neon yellow safety vest 2 sizes too big. Behind her, Todd stood sheepishly holding a clipboard, looking like a kid caught spray painting his own house. Another HOA minion, some guy I didn't even recognize, stood at the edge of my lawn holding a plastic stop sign like he was auditioning for highway duty. Morning, Karen, I said, rubbing sleep out of my eyes. Love the new landscaping. This is a lawful safety closure, she announced, her voice brimming with the authority only someone who's never had real power can manufacture. Due to repeated violations and unsafe property conditions, the HOA has voted to restrict all access to your driveway until further review. I couldn't help it. I laughed, a long, genuine belly laugh that only seemed to infuriate her more. "Karen," I said, still chuckling, "you can't block off my driveway." "Yes, we can," she snapped. HOA Section 5, Subsection 12. Emergency Safety Interventions. When a property is deemed hazardous to community well-being, the HOA has the authority to establish temporary safety barriers. "And who deemed my property hazardous?" "The HOA Safety Subcommittee," she said triumphantly. "Which is you. And Todd," she added, as if his presence made this circus legally binding. I stepped over the plastic chain she'd used to secure the area, grabbed the wooden sign, and with one clean pull, yanked it out of the ground. Karen gasped like I just desecrated a national monument. "This isn't over," she shrieked. "You keep saying that," I said, propping the sign up next to my porch. "But somehow, it always is." Karen's next move made the driveway stunt look downright reasonable. By the time I returned from work that evening, my lawn was gone. Completely. The grass, the garden bed I'd spent 3 years cultivating, the stone border, all of it stripped bare. In its place was a layer of gravel and a crooked sign reading, "Mandatory DROEG, Kigopmp Lions E-Zone, TURF, Remo VAL, or DRED by HOA." I stood there, mouth open, trying to process what I was seeing. Across the street, Karen stood at her window, watching me with the smug satisfaction of someone who thought they'd finally found the ultimate move. My phone buzzed before I could even storm over there. It was Carl, the retired mechanic, barely able to contain his laughter. "She hired a crew this morning." Carl wheezed through the phone. "Paid them in cash. Told them you were donating your lawn to the HOA's Sustainability Initiative." "She stole my lawn," I said, stunned. "She actually stole my lawn." "Yup. Took the whole thing like it was a clearance sale." I was still trying to figure out how to respond when Karen sauntered across the street, clipboard in hand, like she was inspecting a condemned building. "This is what happens when you refuse to cooperate with community standards," she said, gesturing at the bare gravel. "The HOA was forced to intervene. You vandalized my property." "We improved it," she corrected. "Gravel is more environmentally friendly." "Karen," I said, pinching the bridge of my nose, "you're so far out of line, you're in a different CIP code." "This is a community," she huffed. "And communities follow rules." I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and started snapping pictures. Every angle, every inch of bare dirt. Karen's smug smile started to falter. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Documenting the crime scene." "This is not a crime. It's vandalism, trespassing, and property destruction," I said, keeping my voice level. "You're going to want to lawyer up." She sputtered, but I walked inside, leaving her standing there with her clipboard clutched to her chest like a life raft. By the next morning, the county sheriff's office, and not just me, was fully involved. The deputy I sent over was a no-nonsense woman named Ramirez who didn't have the patience for HOA theatrics. She knocked on Karen's door, clipboard in hand, official citation ready. I watched from my porch as Karen opened the door and immediately launched into some story about community beautification initiatives and misunderstandings. Ramirez listened for exactly 10 seconds before cutting her off. "Ma'am," Ramirez said, "you entered private property, altered landscaping without consent, and hired unlicensed contractors to perform work without permits. It was a community improvement project." Karen squealed. "It was illegal," Ramirez said. "You can either come down to the station and fill out a statement, or we can do this the hard way." Karen's face cycled through at least 6 colors, from scarlet to a particularly unflattering shade of eggplant. "This is harassment," she shrieked. Ramirez flipped to the next page of her clipboard. Actually, ma'am, harassment would be your multiple false complaints to county code enforcement, your attempts to detain a homeowner without legal authority, and your misuse of HOA funds for personal vendettas. The neighborhood was gathering. Carl had a lawn chair out. Debbie, the secretary, stood half-hidden behind a tree, whispering into her phone. Todd was nowhere to be seen, probably hiding in his basement. "You can't do this to me," Karen shouted. "We can," Ramirez said. "And we are." I waved at Karen from my porch. "Told you." That's when she did something I didn't expect. She turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door so hard the porch light rattled. "Guess we're doing this the hard way," Ramirez muttered. 2 hours later, Karen's lawyer, some unfortunate soul in a suit that didn't fit, showed up, all apologies and frantic paperwork. He tried to smooth things over, offered to replace my lawn, and even suggested Karen would reconsider her leadership role. But it was too late. I wanted her gone. The next day, I filed my formal complaint with the county, attaching every bit of evidence. The photos, Carl's videos, even the ridiculous laminated HOA notices. I wasn't just going after Karen. I was going after the entire corrupt HOA machine. And Karen, for the first time, she realized she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. The Queen's last stand. It's a funny thing, watching someone lose control over a kingdom they built out of duct tape, gossip, and pure ego. Most people, when cornered by reality, finally come to their senses. They apologize, they back down, they slink away into obscurity. But not Karen. No, Karen took losing as a personal attack on the universe itself. If she couldn't rule the neighborhood with an iron fist, she was perfectly willing to burn the whole thing down just so nobody else could have it. The day after Ramirez read her the riot act, Karen did what any unstable HOA tyrant would do. She declared a state of emergency. I knew something was up the moment I stepped outside that morning. A row of bright yellow caution tape had been stretched across the street, like we were in the middle of a crime scene from a bad TV show. Every driveway, including mine, had been papered with emergency orders taped to mailboxes, trash cans, even a couple of neighborhood dogs. Todd, because of course Todd, was walking around with a whistle and a clipboard, furiously writing down infractions nobody had ever heard of. The notice on my mailbox was a work of art. It read like Karen had hired a failing law student to draft her Magna Carta of Madness. Official notice, community-wide emergency order. By unanimous decision of the HOA Emergency Committee, composed of Karen Thompson and Todd from Lot 4, the neighborhood has been placed under severe conduct monitoring protocol due to ongoing behavioral threats posed by certain disruptive residents. Effective immediately, the following rules apply. No vehicles may be parked in driveways between 7:00 a.m. and 7:00 p.m. without pre-approval. All property modifications, including lawn chairs, decorations, and landscaping, are temporarily prohibited. All outdoor gatherings must be submitted for HOA approval 48 hours in advance. Any resident under investigation for behavioral violations will be subject to 24/7 observation and compliance checks. I had to sit down on my porch and laugh until I nearly dropped my coffee. Karen had officially declared war on reality. Across the street, she stood on her lawn in what I can only describe as a self-appointed general's uniform. A navy windbreaker with HOA enforcement ironed onto the back, a clipboard in one hand, and a pair of binoculars in the other. Her lawn had somehow gained 2 orange traffic cones, a folding table with an incident report center sign, and a cheap security camera duct-taped to a garden gnome. This woman had lost her mind in real time, and I had a front row seat. I didn't even bother pulling down the ridiculous notice from my mailbox. Instead, I made a beeline for City Hall. See, Karen was banking on her usual playbook. If she screamed loud enough and invented enough fake rules, the average homeowner would assume some of it was real. Most folks don't have the time or patience to figure out what's actually legal when they're just trying to mow the lawn or park their car. But I did. The clerk at the city's code compliance office knew me by name at this point, thanks to the Karen files I'd been building for weeks. I dropped the latest collection of photos, notices, and incident reports onto her desk like I was turning in a senior thesis. "Please tell me this woman has finally violated something serious enough for you to drop the hammer," I said. The clerk, a long-suffering woman named Sandra, took one look at the severe conduct monitoring protocol notice and let out the deepest sigh of her life. "She's trying to declare martial law in a suburban cul-de-sac," Sandra said, rubbing her temples. "That's new." "Please," I said, grinning. "Tell me you've got something in the books to shut her down." Sandra flipped through my evidence folder, her expression shifting from exasperated to angry to downright gleeful. "Actually," she said, tapping one page, "she's in violation of 3 municipal codes." "Only 3. 3 that matter." Sandra grinned. "Unauthorized obstruction of public roads, illegal modification of residential property without permits, and unlawful use of non-governmental authority. That last one sounds fancy. It's our polite way of saying you can't pretend to be the government." I could have hugged her. That afternoon, I got a special delivery from City Hall. 3 official-looking cease and desist orders, each one bearing Karen's name, each one signed by the head of the Code Enforcement Division. They were beautiful. I personally taped all 3 to her front door while she watched from her incident report center table, clutching her binoculars like they were rosary beads. "Afternoon, Karen," I called, smiling as I gave the papers a final smoothing pat. "Looks like your emergency powers just expired." She stormed across the lawn, clipboard raised like a weapon. "You can't do this." "Actually," I said, turning to face her, "the city can." And they just did. "You're making a mockery of this neighborhood," she shrieked. "Me?" I laughed. "You're the one with traffic cones and a security gnome." "This isn't over," she yelled, jabbing a finger toward me. "I have rights." "So do I," I said. "And unlike you, I actually know what they are." She stormed back inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle her porch light. Todd, ever the loyal lackey, shuffled after her, looking like he wanted to climb into a storm drain and disappear. The next escalation came at 3 a.m., because of course it did. My security cameras, installed after the great lawn theft, caught her in all her glory. Dressed in all black like a suburban ninja, Karen snuck onto my lawn with a spray bottle and a bucket of what I can only assume was some kind of industrial-strength weed killer. Her plan, it seemed, was to scorch the earth. If she couldn't steal my lawn, she'd just murder it. Unfortunately for her, she tripped over her own cone and fell face first into the bucket. The footage of Karen, covered in her own chemical warfare attempt, crawling back to her yard at 3:15 a.m., is still my phone's lock screen to this day. By sunrise, I had filed another formal complaint, this time directly to the county sheriff's department. Karen wasn't just an overzealous HOA president anymore. She was officially a repeat offender, trespassing, property destruction, harassment, and filing false complaints with county agencies. The deputies didn't even wait this time. By lunchtime, 2 squad cars were parked in front of Karen's house, and Ramirez, the same deputy who had warned her days earlier, was ringing her doorbell. The neighborhood gathered again, lawn chairs popping up like mushrooms. Carl brought popcorn. Debbie pretended to water her hydrangeas, but filmed the whole thing on her phone. Karen tried to bluff her way out of it, but Ramirez wasn't having it. Within minutes, Karen was in handcuffs, shouting about conspiracies and rogue sheriffs and community sabotage. I waved from my porch. "See you at the next emergency meeting," I called. Karen's shriek could probably be heard 3 blocks away. As the squad cars pulled away, I took a deep breath and enjoyed the silence. The neighborhood had always been a little ridiculous, but for the first time in years, it felt peaceful. Sure, there'd be some cleanup, literally, in my case, but for now, The reign of Queen Karen was officially over. But there was still one more surprise coming. And I couldn't wait. The fall of Queen Karen. There's a certain silence that settles over a neighborhood after a storm blows through. Not the eerie, waiting kind of silence. I mean the good silence. The silence when you know something loud, chaotic, and ridiculous has finally worn itself out, and all that's left is the distant sound of birds, lawnmowers, and the faint crackle of someone grilling on their back deck. That was the silence I woke up to the morning after Karen got hauled away in handcuffs. It was bliss. For the first time in weeks, I opened my front door without wondering if some laminated decree was taped to it. My trash cans were still in place. My lawn was undisturbed, even if it was patchy from Karen's failed chemical warfare. And my truck didn't have a single violation sticker in sight. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because Karen might have been temporarily removed from the chessboard, but her legacy of nonsense was still hanging over the neighborhood like a bad smell. The HOA board, her loyal minions, cronies, and clipboard enthusiasts, had been left without their queen, and they were twitching like confused puppets without strings. That's when I decided to go for the kill shot. The emergency HOA meeting. Without Karen. 2 days after Karen's arrest, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Not to apologize, not to clear the air, but to discuss restoring community order. The invitation was slid under my door at 5 a.m. because subtlety was still a foreign concept to these people. I showed up just for the entertainment value. The clubhouse was packed, way more than usual. Normally, these meetings attracted maybe 6 people, but tonight, at least 30 neighbors were crammed into folding chairs, most of them there purely to see how badly the HOA would flop without their fearless leader. Todd stood at the front, looking like a deer that had wandered onto a highway and forgotten how legs work. He had inherited Karen's gavel, which he clutched like a lifeline, his fingers twitching every time someone coughed. Thank you all for coming," Todd began, voice cracking. "As acting president, I." "Who voted you acting president?" Carl's voice rang out from the back. Todd stammered. "Well, technically, Karen appointed me before her situation." "That's not how this works," shouted Debbie the secretary, whose loyalties were suddenly shifting faster than a politician in an election year. "We're supposed to elect a new president." A rumble of agreement rolled through the room. "I nominate Carl," someone yelled. Carl stood up, holding his beer can aloft like it was a scepter. "I decline. I like drinking too much." Laughter rippled through the room, but the point had been made. Nobody wanted another Karen. They wanted something better. Something saner. That's when I stood up. "How about," I said loud enough to Carrie, "we stop acting like this is some kind of medieval fiefdom, and remember the HOA is supposed to help the neighborhood, not police it." Murmurs of agreement. Heads nodded. Even Debbie, the human grammar check, was nodding along. Todd's face went pale. We have rules." "We do," I agreed. "Rules like electing board members every year, which you haven't done since Karen put herself on the throne." That got a full-on cheer from the back. And I added, "Maybe we stop using HOA funds for fake emergency barricades, illegal lawn theft, and personalized vendettas." The room erupted. It was a mix of laughter, applause, and muttered stories from residents who'd apparently all been harassed by Karen over the years, but had been too scared to push back. Until now. I walked to the front, right up to Todd, and held out my hand. "The HOA doesn't need a dictator, Todd. It needs to go back to being a volunteer group that plans barbecues and sends reminders when someone leaves their Christmas lights up till April. That's it." He stared at me, gulped, and set the gavel down like it was radioactive. "Motion to dissolve the current HOA leadership and schedule new elections," someone shouted from the back. "Seconded," yelled Debbie, who was suddenly very invested in democracy. "All in favor?" I asked. Every single hand went up. It was done. The investigation into Karen. With the HOA leadership dissolved, Karen's grip on the neighborhood wasn't just broken, it was shattered. But the best part was still coming. The formal complaints I'd filed, combined with the cease and desist orders, the trespassing charges, and the evidence I'd collected, all made their way to the county investigator's office. Karen had committed enough violations to trigger a full financial audit of the HOA accounts. That's when the real dirt came out. Turns out, Karen hadn't just been terrorizing residents. She'd been skimming from HOA funds for years. Fake invoices to non-existent landscaping companies. Phantom charges for security enhancements, which, presumably, included her duct-taped security gnome. Even the community improvement project that ended with her stripping my lawn bare was billed to the HOA under emergency infrastructure repairs. The total, almost $43,000. Gone. And it wasn't just me filing charges anymore. Once the news spread, at least a dozen other residents came forward with their own horror stories. Fines for imaginary violations, threats of property liens, even forged signatures on fake board decisions. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a one-woman crime spree. The final goodbye. The last time I saw Karen, she was standing in her driveway, boxes piled around her, as a for sale sign swayed in the wind. Her house, the very kingdom she'd ruled over like a lunatic monarch, was being sold to cover legal fees and restitution. She spotted me across the street. "This is all your fault," she hissed. I raised my coffee cup. "Take care, Karen. You ruined this neighborhood." "No, Karen," I said, smiling. "I saved it." She climbed into her car, a garish lime green SUV with a HOA Forever bumper sticker peeling off the back, and drove away for good. The new HOA, without the stupid, with Karen gone, the new HOA was a breath of fresh air. No more laminated violation notices, no more plastic handcuffs, no more fake emergency barricades. We went back to potlucks, yard sale weekends, and friendly reminders to cut your grass. And that was it. The best part, the first new HOA president was Carl's dog, Duke, at least in spirit. We didn't bother with a formal president. Every issue was handled by vote, over burgers and beers, with Duke getting an honorary title and a vote of his own. The laminated HOA rulebook, we burned it at the next neighborhood barbecue. It was beautiful. Epilogue. Karen's new kingdom. Rumor has it Karen moved 3 towns over, bought into a new neighborhood, and immediately ran for HOA president. The last I heard, she was trying to install a neighborhood curfew and mandatory lawn inspections. But this time, she ran into a problem. One of her new neighbors, a retired judge. Good luck, Karen.